I'm crying because I'm such a bad fawn.
Such a terrible fawn.
I am, you see. I'm a very bad fawn.
I'm a great fawn. I don't know what you're talking about. Netflix purchased the Chronicles of Narnia more than 5 years ago, and they've been just dangling it in front of fans ever since. Like a Turkish delight we're never allowed to have. But recently, it seems like they've actually made some progress towards finally moving forward with their movie adaptations. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is the most famous chronicle, and while it's technically the second book in the series, it is the first one that Clive Staples Lewis wrote and published in 1950. This book has been adapted many times in a variety of ways.
You have a traitor there, Aslan.
His offense was not against you.
Have you forgotten the deep magic?
What Lucy is saying is true. There really is another world beyond the wardrobe.
There have also been adaptations of Prince Caspian and The Voyage of the Dawn Treader from Walden Media in 2008 and 2010 respectively, and from the BBC in 1989. The BBC also created a miniseries version of The Silver Chair in 1990, which is the only film adaptation of The Silver Chair that currently exists. 3 of the books, The Magician's Nephew, The Horse and His Boy, and The Last Battle, have never been adapted for screen. I am hoping the Netflix reboot starts with The Magician's Nephew because that one is my favorite and I really want to see it. And the whole purpose behind this video is the fact that Netflix does not always finish what they start. So if we only get one movie, I want that to be it. If The Magician's Nephew was also your favorite Narnia book, and you grew up into like kind of a weird adult who likes dark modern fantasy that's both funny and disturbing, then I recommend watching the show The Magicians. I believe it aired on Sci-Fi, and it might be available on Netflix right now. It is based on a series of books, but I actually like the show better. And The Magicians draws clear inspiration from the Chronicles of Narnia, specifically The Magician's Nephew. Like it's right there in the name, The Magician's Nephew. Yeah, you didn't need me to draw that conclusion. Like, you got that. Anyway, most of the time when TV or movie adaptations of books fail, it's because they stray too far from the source material and they just fail to capture the spirit of the original work. But in my opinion, that doesn't mean that adaptations should try to recreate the original story beat for beat, because that can sometimes be tedious and boring. So please join me on this journey through the Chronicles of Netflix, How Not to Kill This Franchise. Chronicle 1, Why the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe Works. That type of close beat-for-beat adaptation of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe generally does work, and that is for 3 specific reasons. 1, Wardrobe was written first, so because it served as an introduction to the world for the author, it also does make a good introduction to the world for the reader. 2, Wardrobe is a little bit more narratively complex than the other Narnia books. And 3, nostalgia. Wardrobe is usually presented in isolation. Either it comes first or it's the only Narnia chronicle that gets adapted. And there are several different interweaving components within the narrative. The intrigue of discovering a mysterious magical world with the overarching villain of the witch, but also the more subtle emotional conflict of Edmund's betrayal. There's a prophecy, there's a curse, there are magical objects, there's Santa! There's also the mystery of who is Aslan. But after Wardrobe, you know the rules of the land, you know the animals talk, you know who Aslan is. The prophecy has been fulfilled, the curse has been lifted, all has been explained. And now the rest of the books have to stand on their own merits. It's kind of a double-edged sword. Since Wardrobe is the most popular Narnia book, it's the one that's most frequently adapted, so it's the one that people are most familiar with. which means that they're more likely to give a new adaptation a chance, but they also expect that adaptation to exactly match the story that they remember. But fewer people have such strong associations with the other Narnia Chronicles, so that means that adaptations of those books should focus on being really good standalone stories, rather than just focusing on being 100% book faithful adaptations. Not as many people are sitting around going, yeah, The Horse and His Boy was my favorite childhood book. You know, Shasta better match the picture that I have of him in my head. Chronicle 2. Why a close adaptation won't work for the other books. The Narnia books were originally written for very young children, so once you remove the broader mysteries from wardrobe and the magic of discovering a strange new world, the other books get much simpler and very disjointed. Here's the thing about the Chronicles of Narnia. This is not Lord of the Rings. This is not Game of Thrones. Clive Staples Lewis created this beautiful, lush fantasy world. Like, there are maps at the start of the books. This is a maps kind of series. But he didn't really create any rules or a detailed history. There's no history of Middle-earth or fire and blood for Narnia. The primary themes that Clive incorporated into his work were pretty unsubtle allusions to Christianity and morality, which is fine, but those themes alone cannot carry 7 movies. I assume by this point that everyone knows that Aslan is Jesus. Like, he's not an allegory for Jesus. He is actually, literally Jesus. In The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, towards the end, he tells Lucy that he exists in our world, just under a different name.
In your world, I have another name. You must learn to know me by it.
The death of Aslan in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, him exchanging his dignity and his life for Edmund's soul, is of course representative of Jesus suffering and dying on the cross. I guess he does this a lot. You know, when you think about the torture and death of Aslan, as well as several other elements in the books, Narnia is surprisingly grim. Like, there's not a lot of blood, but there's plenty of corpses. These books are for kids. They also just so happen to contain witchcraft and war and violent torture and death. It's like the Bible. My flippant attitude towards religion is going to make some people angry. But these stories, as written by Clive Staples Lewis, just aren't very deep. The characters don't have much of an inner world. There's not a lot of nuance. You can see any sort of plot twist coming from a mile away, and the moral of the story is always obvious. And there are some inconsistencies because Clive didn't have a plan for Narnia, the land or the books. He wasn't as interested in developing the rules of magic or complex systems of politics like other fantasy authors who were writing for adults. In the same way that he didn't build out the mythology or the world, he didn't really flesh out his characters. Like, all the human children are pretty interchangeable archetypes. If I were to ask you what are the biggest personality differences between Polly and Jill, you might just say, who? The characters served the story, and the story was usually pretty straightforward. This was not a series planned from book 1. Clive wrote the books out of order. Like I said, Wardrobe was the second book, but it was published first. And after that, Clive kind of just made things up as he went, and then placed the disparate books into a vaguely chronological order. Clive famously came up with his stories by visualizing neat images in his head and then writing plots and characters around those images. I've read that his lack of cohesive world building and consistent writing drove his good friend J.R.R. Tolkien just absolutely insane. Tolkien hated Narnia. However, there are a lot of elements that he alludes to but never explores in the text, or neat little ideas that he just throws out there and then forgets about. So I think that all of the pieces are there for the right script writer to also just put on their fanfic writer hat and really flesh out these stories into some very compelling and interesting movies. Unless your target audience is kids who would unironically enjoy the Land Before Time sequels, you cannot adapt the other Narnia Chronicles in the same straightforward way as The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's just not going to work as well. And then the franchise is going to die. Again. Chronicle 3. Specific examples so you know that I know what I'm talking about. I recently decided to reread The Silver Chair and then rewatch the BBC miniseries adaptation. When I was a kid, The Silver Chair and The Last Battle were tied as my second favorite Narnia books, but The Silver Chair had the BBC adaptation available at the local Blockbuster, and I made my parents rent it. Like a lot. In hindsight, I'm surprised I didn't just pull the car over and open the door and let me run out into a field and then just drive away. So I can conclusively say that the BBC's Silver Chair is incredibly true to the book. Much of the dialogue is the same, the scenes play out the same way. It is the closest thing to a beat-for-beat adaptation that anyone could hope for. But if you're looking at it as a potential installment of an epic franchise, it's kind of bad. It's really a prime example of why adaptations sometimes need to make changes. We'll talk specifically about the BBC adaptation a little bit later, but first I want to give you some specific examples from the books that illustrate all of my earlier points. Spoilers for the Chronicles of Narnia. Just blanket spoilers for all of the Chronicles. So in The Silver Chair, there is a green witch. Now, we all know the White Witch, Jadis, who was defeated by Aslan in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but this is a green witch. Is she the same as the White Witch? We don't know. The narrative just describes her as a northern witch and probably of the same sort as Jadis. BBC muddied the issue by casting the same actress to play both the White Witch and the Green Witch in their adaptations. But if you've read The Magician's Nephew, you know that Jadis was a powerful being from another world. Actually, a dead world that she killed by speaking the deplorable word. And she was brought first to Earth and then accidentally to Narnia during its creation. So is the Green Witch a reincarnation of Jadis? Did Jadis have children while she was exiled in the North before conquering Narnia? Is the Green Witch an apprentice of Jadis? Are they just second cousins twice removed? We don't know. We don't have any of those answers. Because Clive actually wrote and published Silver Chair 2 years before The Magician's Nephew. Yep, the 6th book came before the 1st book. Like I said, he didn't really have a plan. And on one hand, you might think, what does it matter? Stop nitpicking, Christina. But on the other hand, the Green Witch is the villain of an entire book. And we know nothing about her except that she's a northern witch with some vague, unknown connection to Jadis. She can turn into a big green snake. And she wants to conquer Narnia. Currently, she is a one-dimensional villain, but there is an opportunity to expand her backstory and still stay within the parameters of the world that C.S. Lewis created. At the very least, you could kind of clarify her motives and maybe even increase the stakes. Or at least just add a little intrigue. Another example, in The Last Battle, the 7th and final Narnia book, Narnia experiences its apocalypse. And all of our relevant human characters, including the Pevensey siblings, suddenly find themselves in a Narnia-based afterlife. And it turns out that the Pevensey siblings and their parents were there too, they were all on a train. And the train crashed. And now they're dead. Except Susan. Susan wasn't on the train. And this is the issue that's commonly regarded as the problem with Susan. Susan was no longer considered a friend to Narnia because she was so concerned with being a grown-up and wearing makeup and going to parties. Apparently, she convinced herself that Narnia wasn't real, that it was just a fun game that they played as kids. It's kind of brushed off in the narrative, but modern readers and author Neil Gaiman have pointed out that Susan is still on Earth, but her entire family is dead, and she now needs to bury both her siblings and her parents. This is the part of the video where I start getting heated. And this book takes place in 1949. So Susan would have been 21 years old in a world where a woman could not get a loan or buy property without a man. Theoretically, she could inherit money or property from her dead family. I checked. But to do a lot of financial or legal things, she would need a father, a brother, or a husband. None of which she has. C.S. Lewis has written in letters to children would write to him and he would write back to them. And he has said that just because Susan is no longer a friend of Narnia now does not mean that she cannot make it to Narnia later. But in the meantime, she's still alive and having to navigate this very difficult world. So there are just a lot of consequences for Susan that C.S. Lewis didn't even think about. There's also the fact that during The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the Pevensey siblings ruled Narnia for 15 years. They lived in Narnia longer than they had lived outside of it. Peter entered Narnia at 13, fought in battles where he killed other sentient beings, and then grew into a 28-year-old king. Lucy, the youngest, was 8 when she came to Narnia and became a queen, and then she grew into a 23-year-old woman. And then suddenly, after ruling for 15 years, Narnia kicked them out. So Susan was a 27-year-old queen one day and a 12-year-old girl the next. Can you imagine how traumatic that would be? Susan is criticized for wanting to grow up so fast, but can you imagine going from a powerful 27-year-old queen in a magical fantasy land to a 12-year-old girl in the middle of World War II? That's actually pretty dark, even though the narrative does not treat it that way. But wouldn't it be interesting to actually see some realistic consequences for that? And then, in Prince Caspian, the Pevensey siblings are pulled back yet again to do a magical quest for the land that once rejected them. And once they have successfully completed that quest, Narnia still kicks them out again. And Peter and Susan are told that they are too old to ever return. I have a lot of feelings and I'm dressed like a fawn. Yeah, Susan's going to have some issues. No wonder she convinced herself that Narnia wasn't real. No wonder she was in such a hurry to feel like an adult again. The 2008 Prince Caspian movie addresses this a little bit, but mostly focused on Peter.
I mean, don't you ever get tired of being treated like a kid?
We are kids.
Well, I wasn't always. It's been a year.
But the books just don't. Also, I'm kind of going on a tangent with this, but at the end of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the four Pevensey siblings are out riding, they're chasing the white stag, and they come across the lamppost, and they've forgotten what it is and that they've ever seen it before, and three of the siblings want to continue onward, which is the path that ends up taking them out of Narnia. But Susan is the only one who has a bad feeling about it and thinks that they should turn back. So theoretically, if they had listened to Susan, they would have stayed in Narnia. Even if C.S. Lewis didn't intend it, there is a potential storyline there that expands upon Susan's relationship with Narnia and how it was different from her siblings. I'm always so curious about the time that they were the king and queens of Narnia, because there are multiple mentions in the books about how so many dudes want to marry Susan and Lucy. And I just feel like in all of that time that they were there, one of those siblings had to have gotten married. Like, Peter was 28. You know, as a monarch, that's how you forge political alliances. And it was sort of a plot point in The Horse and His Boy. So wouldn't that be interesting? Like, one of them got married, maybe had kids, and then suddenly disappeared. Also, it is a little messed up that only people from Earth can be the monarchs in Narnia. Like, the Narnian people can't rule their own country. And the show that I mentioned earlier, The Magicians, does address that a little bit. By the way, speaking of children, in case you were like, hey, wait a minute, since only people from Earth can be kings and queens of Narnia, then what about Prince Caspian? How can he be king? Is he from Earth? Is he a descendant of the Pevensey siblings? No! Prince Caspian is a Telmarine, and the Telmarines were pirates from Earth who sailed into a cave and accidentally got stuck in Narnia and couldn't leave. No big deal. Don't worry about it. Back on track with another example. In The Magician's Nephew, one of the main children characters, Diggory, has this crazy old uncle, Uncle Andrew, who fancies himself a magician. Is because that leads to the title, The Magician's Nephew. Anyway, near the very beginning of the book, Uncle Andrew suddenly drops this crazy multi-page monologue about how his godmother was the last woman on Earth with fairy blood, and towards the end of her life she got real weird and went to prison. He doesn't tell us why. And then she got sick, and so she gave him this box to destroy after she died, but he didn't destroy it, he kept it, and it turned out that the box was from Atlantis, and he opened it and it contained like dust from another world. All of this is backstory to set up the fact that Uncle Andrew used that dust to create magical rings that send the children to another world and eventually leads to them finding Narnia. But like, I want to know more about Atlantis and how Atlantis connects with fairies. It is just 3 pages of bizarre, fascinating lore that's just dropped there, and then everyone moves on. Except for me. I never moved on. I've been obsessed with it for decades. Also, 3 pages out of a 116-page book is kind of a lot. Also, when you think about translating books into movies, like, no one is going to want to watch a character just go on an extended monologue with this insane backstory that has absolutely zero bearing on the plot of the rest of the movie. These are just a few examples, but if you are looking at adapting this entire series, there are so many opportunities to really expand the world and to flesh out the characters while still staying true to the spirit of the books. The worst thing they could do is just create a straightforward adaptation of all of the Chronicles of Narnia with only the surface level plot. They don't need to make it for Riverdale audiences and like fully modernize Narnia with sex and TikTok or whatever. That's what The Magicians is for. But look at the core themes of the work and expand on them. Like, actually take the consequences that Clive just kind of brushes past and include them in the story. Please don't think I'm saying the original books are bad or poorly written. They are absolute classics and I love them. Clive just came up with fascinating details and visuals and characters as he needed them. And just because the books aren't complex doesn't mean that they're dumb. But the books are essentially fairy tales written for children in the 1950s. And the expectations for media, specifically children's media, have changed over the years. There's been a growing idea that children and young adults can really appreciate stories with character arcs and nuance and strong emotional beats. I don't have kids, so I've never watched Bluey, but I hear it's a show for children that's making adults cry, like on the regular. Realistically, a large part of the audience is going to be adults. Like, just look at the Disney Plus Percy Jackson series. I think they expected most of the viewers to be like preteens or early teens or kids, but most of them were adults. To continue the Disney metaphor, a straightforward adaptation of the Narnia Chronicles would be giving us 1937 Snow White levels of nuance, when really, to be successful, they need to be bringing us Elsa. I was originally going to do like a White Witch type of costume for this video, but everything that was coming up was just Elsa costumes. So Netflix should approach Narnia with a broader and more mentally complex audience in mind, which means that they're going to need to think critically and look beyond just visually recreating the specific scenes and words that C.S. Lewis put on the page. It's going to require some strong writing. One potential avenue is aiming for more of a PG-13 rating, like actually having some blood along with their corpses, and just really leaning in to some of the weird dark elements that are already in the story. In terms of tone, you'd want to hit somewhere between Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones. Like, if you reach Game of Thrones, you've gone too far. That's just one option though, and I could easily see that just going poorly with the wrong writer or director. Either way, I do think that it is possible to create movies that strike the appropriate balance of being true to the original stories while also being compelling for modern audiences. But at the very least, they need to look at the characters and say, who are they? What do they want? What are they afraid of? Where is the internal conflict? And this need becomes very obvious when you watch the BBC adaptation of The Silver Chair. My wig is sliding backwards. I don't have it like pinned down or anything. Like, I don't get fancy. We don't get fancy here. Chronicle 4, BBC's The Silver Chair. It's terrible. I mean, it's terrible in a way that I love, but wouldn't make a lot of money. The main characters, the children from Earth, are Jill Pole and Eustace Scrubb. Eustace has already been to Narnia in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and he and Jill have now been summoned to go on a quest to find the missing Prince Rilian, King Caspian's son. Jill and Eustace have one main motivation: to do the thing that Aslan told them to do. They don't really have any personal stakes, like they don't really have any internal conflict. They wanted to escape the bullies at their school, and now they did that, and they're just here now. The dialogue is very true to the books, and it sounds like this.
We've missed the first sign. Who will help us now? How will we even begin to find the lost prince?
Oh, shut up. Anyway, what were the other signs?
Aslan is also accurate to the book, but on film he comes off as kind of a creep.
Will you promise not to do anything to me if
I will make no promise.
Do you eat girls?
I have swallowed up girls, boys, women, and men.
The pacing is very slow. Much of the book is about the journey, like literally the journey of Jill and Eustace and Puddleglum the Marshwiggle traveling north over rough and cold terrain. But this is what the BBC show is like. It's just a lot of this for like an hour. Jill has a dream at one point.
No!
Tell me the signs, child.
And it is 100% accurate to the book.
Please forgive me. Please forgive me. I'm so sorry, please. Please forgive me.
The book is also written from the perspective of a third-person omniscient narrator, so the narrator is often describing what the different characters are thinking or feeling or remembering. The narrator is giving background and adding context to situations, but unless you have an audible narration during the movie, you're going to lose that aspect of the story. And then you'll just have these long stretches of time where nothing is happening. But if you cut out the long stretches, then you're not really gonna have a lot of movie left. They see giants playing a game where they throw boulders, and it's inconvenient, but it doesn't really impede their journey. They run into the Green Witch once and have a brief conversation.
Why, good day to you, travelers. Some of you are very young pilgrims to be walking this rough waste.
It's very windy in Narnia.
But have a care. On whatever day you reach Harfang, come not to the door too late.
What? I can't hear you guys over the wind. They don't encounter a ton of obstacles until they reach a city full of giants who secretly want to eat them. But even still, they're able to sleep and rest and bathe and eat and then escape, mostly without incident.
We must be visible for miles.
We are.
What's that? It's them.
Keep walking, keep walking.
And then during their escape, they kind of just stumble into the underground kingdom that's ruled over by the Green Witch. She's keeping these gorgeous cave-dwelling creatures. They're just stunning. I love them. Along with the brainwashed Prince Rillian in her thrall.
Welcome, overworlders. Welcomed.
In the BBC show, the choices that the actor playing Rillian makes are interesting.
Sending us off to a castle of giants to be eaten for dinner. We never did her any harm.
How dare you speak so of the Queen, insolent boy!
All of the dialogue is accurate, but my interpretation in the books was just kind of like a handsome, charming idiot. Just like, no thoughts, head empty. But this guy is like, no, I'm gonna yell a lot.
You sound to me as though you'll be a wicked tyrant.
What? Is the little maid a deep politician?
And touch everyone's faces. She's real close.
I see your meaning.
Please give the 11-year-old girl some room, sir. Like, room for the Lord. Or like, what did they say at middle school dances when they wanted like the two people to have some space between them? Was it like, room for Jesus? Room for the Holy Spirit? Room for Aslan? Either way, Rillian's not doing it. The best scene in the book is when the prince, who they don't know yet that he's the prince, but he tells them that he is under a curse, and there is 1 hour every night where he will go mad. And if he's not bound, he'll turn into a big snake and kill people. So he gets tied to a chair, a silver chair, and he tells them not to let him go no matter what. He is going to lie and beg and plead and say whatever he thinks will get them to untie him. But if they do, he is definitely going to turn into a snake and murder them. Full-on snake murder. So the hour is upon them, and he is begging them to set him free, saying that the witch is keeping him captive, and during the rest of the day he's under a curse. But this hour is the one time that he's free, and he promises that he 100% will not turn into a big murder snake.
Have they told you that if I am released I shall go berserk and kill you? See by your faces that they have. It is a lie!
And then he commands them in the name of Aslan to release him.
By the great lion, by Aslan himself! Set me free.
And then they realize, oh no, this might actually be the missing prince. Or he's lying, and as per his previous statements, they're about to get jumped by a big reptile. They ultimately untie him, and it turns out he was the prince, yay, but then the Green Witch appears, and she turns into a big murder snake. So they kill her, escape the underground, and are able to return the prince to Narnia.
It is the prince. It is Prince Rillian.
Here's what the snake transformation looks like in the BBC version. Beautiful. I'm obsessed with it. Then Eustace and Jill go back to their own world, and Aslan appears to scare some school children bullies. What would Jesus do? This, I guess. But much of the 150-page book is just moving from one place to another place. And then when they get to that place, something happens, so they start going to another place. But in between, it's just a lot of walking, or being on a boat, or being on a horse, or being on a centaur. As you can see in the BBC miniseries, this does not really translate well to screen. And since the text is so surface level, like there's not really a whole lot going on. You know, there's no character development, there are no character arcs, there are no subplots. It feels like the characters at the end of the story are in exactly the same place they were at the beginning of the story. Except now they provided free labor to a foreign land. Huzzah. And in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, literally, that's literally what happens. We have a hard reset back to the status quo at the beginning of the book. Except Edmund hopefully retained the valuable lesson of don't betray your family for snacks. Even when there is action, there are no layers to it. The story in Silver Chair is as straightforward as I described it. However, at the beginning, we learn that Jill is being bullied. And she used to be bullied by Eustace before he had his Dawn Treader adventure and came back a better person. They acknowledge this history at the beginning, but Eustace basically says, well, I'm a different person now, so you can't hold my past against me. And then Jill just lets it go.
Now look here.
I'll go away and mind your own business. I should have known you'd be on their side. Is that fair? I may have been like that last year. You were horrible. But yes, you have changed.
But wouldn't it be more interesting if these two kids who were stuck together on an adventure in another world actually had to work through that history, and maybe the conflict would impact their journey in some way? Or, and I admit this is more of a jump, but maybe Eustace could struggle with not falling back into his old ways, and maybe he could consider that Caspian, the current king of Narnia, is very old, and he has no heir. And the king of Narnia can only be someone from Earth, like Eustace. So maybe he doesn't want to find Prince Rillian, so he can be king of Narnia. A little internal conflict. On the Narnia side of things, at the very beginning of the story, Prince Rillian and his mom are out riding when the mom is attacked by a giant snake and killed. And then at the end of the story, we find out that the giant snake was the witch. I mean, anyone with like basic literacy skills realized it the whole time, but still. And Rillian's mom is Caspian's wife, who he picked up in Voyage of the Dawn Treader. She was a daughter of the stars, and her death is only addressed in passing. But also, to kidnap Rillian, the Green Witch didn't have to kill the mom. She turned into a snake and killed the Star Mom, and then Rillian came back later to hunt the snake and saw the Green Witch and fell under her spell. But why didn't she just enchant Rillian to begin with? Like when he and his mom were out riding into the woods and they got separated, the witch went after the mom. Like, why didn't she just go and hypnotize Rillian? Why kill the mom? There's a line in the book that says that the queen was desperately trying to tell Rillian something as she died, but she couldn't speak, and I will read you the specific passage. As long as the life was in her, she seemed to be trying hard to tell him something, but she could not speak clearly, and whatever her message was, she died without delivering it. And that never comes back. What was she trying to tell him? Rillian saw the snake, so she wasn't trying to tell him like, hey, a snake bit me. Like, did she know that it wasn't a snake? Did she recognize the witch? We don't know. By the way, the death of the queen is just dropped in as backstory provided by the omniscient narrator. So if they do the Narnia movies in order, then by the time we get to number 6, like, people will be familiar enough with the world that I think the movie should open with the riding party and the death of the queen and the seduction of Prince Rillian just as part of the main narrative. Also, the Green Witch expresses that she intends to marry Rillian to become the king and queen of Narnia together. So was she just using him? Or was this maybe more of a Queen Beryl kind of situation, where she's a witch who was in love with the prince from afar, but then she ultimately turned to evil magic, trying to find a way to get him to love her back? I'm not necessarily saying that this is exactly what they have to do, or these are the specific questions they need to be asking. I'm just trying to point out that there's a lot there. There are so many things that kind of exist just under the surface of the main narrative, and it would really enrich these movies if, like, whoever the scriptwriter is just kind of digs just a little bit. Just saying the Green Witch is evil because she is the villain isn't really gonna work with modern audiences. Like, that's not going to be a satisfying story. Chronicle 5. Further up and further in. According to recent reports, Greta Gerwig is set to write and direct at least 2 Narnia films. We don't know which 2. I'm familiar with some of her movies, but I'm not super familiar with all of her work as a scriptwriter. It seems like most of her highly acclaimed projects are set more in the modern world. Aside from potentially the Snow White reboot that's not even out yet, she hasn't really written a lot of fantasy, unless you count Barbie. And The Chronicles of Narnia is primarily 2 things: a period piece and an epic fantasy. But she does seem to be regarded as a strong writer, and that is what this series needs. It needs a strong writer who appreciates nuance and who can understand themes and who can set a really solid framework for the entire series. I think Netflix seems capable of producing visually beautiful movies, and it's usually terrible writing that kills a project. So if you have even like a half-decent writer, I think Narnia stands a chance. This video started as purely wanting to discuss the BBC Silverchair miniseries. Like, you saw that snake transformation? How could I not? But the further I got into working on it, the more I began to think about why previous adaptations of the Chronicles of Narnia ultimately failed, and what Netflix needs to do to create movies that are not a disappointment to fans of the series, but also successful enough to not get canceled after 2 or 3 movies. Maybe, finally, we can get a full set of 7 films adapting each of the Chronicles of Narnia. Like, I want to see the Narnian apocalypse put on screen. Like, look at this book cover. I want to see this movie.
Goodbye, Aslan. Goodbye.
Bye, Aslan.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye, Aslan.
Goodbye, Aslan. See ya.